Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my discussion video for October's chapters of Our Mutual Friend, which we are currently reading for the Dickens Along, or the Our Mutual Friend Victorian style read-along, which is currently going on. If you don't know about this by now, in this read-along, basically we read a few chapters a month of Our Mutual Friend, just as the Victorians would have done at the time. So in the month of October, we read 3 chapters, which were in fact the first 3 chapters of Book 2 of 4 of Our Mutual Friend, and these 3 chapters were Chapter 1, of an educational character, Chapter 2, still educational, and Chapter 3, a piece of work. So I, as usual, am going to go through these 3 chapters, talk about vaguely what happens in them, and also about things of significance within these chapters. I'm very excited about these chapters because they involve the introduction of some characters who we have yet to meet in the book until this point, and that makes me very happy because some of these characters are my favourites. So yes, let's go. Chapter 1 of Book 2 of Our Mutual Friend is of an educational character, and in this chapter we see Charlie Hexam, Lizzie's brother, who we have met a few times before, but we see him in a slightly different environment now. After his father's death, he has got on well at school, and he is now training to be a teacher, effectively, under the schoolmaster Bradley Headstone, who we also encounter in this chapter. We witness a conversation between Charlie and Bradley Headstone, in which Charlie is assessing the fact that he is going to see his sister and wondering how he will find his sister, and how his sister's status in life will affect Charlie's. And Charlie persuades Mr. Headstone to come with him to visit his sister because he feels that Mr. Headstone may be able to best judge whether his association with his sister will drag him down in life or not. As they leave the school, we are also introduced to Miss Peacher, who is the schoolmistress at the school, who is slightly in love with Bradley Headstone and gazes on at him slightly longingly as he leaves. So Charlie and Mr. Headstone go on through London, and they find themselves in the place where Lizzie now lives, and they meet the person of the house, the doll's dressmaker, Jenny Wren, who I mentioned before is possibly my favourite character in all of Dickens, possibly my favourite character in all of literature. I don't know, but she's definitely close up there. I think she's glorious. She's a bit eccentric, but she's wonderful. She is a 13-year-old girl. She is disabled. She is a doll's dressmaker who works for her living, is the breadwinner of the house because her father is always drunk, and she also is kind of the landlady to Lizzie Hexam, who is lodging with them. Charlie and Mr. Headstone don't exactly know what to make of her and are a bit confused, but she does that to people. She slightly unsettles people in a kind of purposeful and wonderful way. As Mr. Headstone and Charlie are talking to Jenny Wren, Lizzie comes downstairs and they meet her. Charlie has not seen her for a while, and Bradley Headstone has never met her before and is quite taken with her, shall we say. What follows is a conversation between Charlie and Lizzie, in which Charlie is trying to persuade Lizzie to leave their old life behind and to raise herself up in the world, as he is doing, because he wants her to be respectable and doesn't feel that she is, whereas Lizzie is really quite happy as she is and doesn't feel the need to rise in that way that Charlie does. And the chapter ends with Charlie and Bradley going back home, going back to the school, and discussing what has happened and discussing the future of Lizzie as Charlie's sister. And on their way back, they also run into or pass by Eugene Rayburn walking along. Bradley has a hunch that Eugene may be going to see Lizzie, but Charlie is adamant that that could not be the case, and off Eugene Rayburn goes. So, things of interest within this chapter. There are so many, not to mention the fact that it introduces Jenny Wren and Bradley Headstone, 2 of the best drawn characters in all of Dickens in my opinion, but it's also just great, and we do get to see Charlie and Lizzie develop quite a lot in this chapter and really see a lot more of how the direction that their characters are going into. So let's start off with the character of Charlie, because Charlie is a really interesting character within Our Mutual Friend and kind of embodies the selfishness of respectability and of certain middle-class ideologies within the Victorian period, because Charlie is this character who has been born in a very, very low position and has been educated and is rising in the world, but he is so focused on his social position and on his respectability that he ends up being quite cruel to his sister in some points in this chapter. But Dickens says of Charlie, "It was his better nature to be true to her, if it were his worse nature to be wholly selfish." And in Book 1, I think we see much more of Charlie's better nature. We see the part of him that wishes to be true to his sister, that really is grateful for everything his sister has done to him. But in this chapter, we really see the worst side of Charlie Hexam, the side who doesn't view his sister so much as a human being in her own right, but only views his sister and her life in relation to how it affects him. There's this sense throughout the chapter of Charlie rising and Lizzie staying where she is, and the social gulf that this leads between them. "I don't want, as I raise myself, to shake you off, Liz. I want to carry you up with me. That's what I want to do and mean to do. I know what I owe to you. I said to Mr. Headstone this very evening, after all, my sister has got me here. Well then, don't pull me back and don't hold me down." And what he says to Mr. Headstone near the end of the chapter is, I think, the most telling and really sums up everything in Charlie's attitude. It's a painful thing to think that if I get on as well as you hope, I shall be, I won't say disgraced because I don't mean disgrace, but rather put to the blush if it was known, by a sister who has been very good to me. And there is this sense of Charlie, this great conflict within him, between his better nature and his worse, between the selfish aspect of his character and the part of him that is grateful and that loves Lizzie as a sister, and also to an extent as a mother, because she is a bit older than him and he has in a way been brought up by her. And that, I think, is something really interesting that Dickens does here in developing Charlie's character, but also at the same time really focusing on that theme of respectability, which is so important throughout the book, because basically he's talking about the difference between Charlie as someone rising and Lizzie staying still, and the fact that Lizzie is in this house with this slightly odd girl who runs the house even though she's about 13 and has a very drunken father, and how that kind of unrespectable position that she's in really bothers Charlie, because what he wants is for her to have a respectable life, to be respectable, like Bradley Headstone, who is a very respectable man. So let us dwell for a moment on Bradley Headstone, because I do think he's a brilliant character and he's so cleverly and brilliantly drawn. I think he's one of Dickens's best creations, and to see him introduced in this chapter is really, really interesting, and what Dickens does with Bradley Headstone is fascinating. It's interesting, in my Penguin Classics edition it has like Dickens's working notes for each chapter at the back of the book, and for a while he was experimenting with different names for Bradley Headstone, and one of the alternate names was Amos Deadstone. The name itself is quite interesting because it signifies not only this kind of sinister, morbid feel really, but also this idea of being like a stone, of being lacking emotion or being in some way repressed. Because the first things we are told about Bradley Headstone is that he is decent, he is respectable, but also he is repressed. Bradley Headstone, in his decent black coat and decent white shirt and decent formal black tie and decent pantaloon of pepper and salt and his decent silver watch in his pocket and its decent hair guard round his neck, looked a thoroughly decent young man of 26. He was never seen in any other dress, and yet there was a certain stiffness in his manner of wearing it, as if there were a want of adaptation between him and it, recalling some mechanics in their holiday clothes. And then later, suppression of so much to make room for so much had given him a constrained manner over and above, yet there was enough of what was animal, of what was fiery, though smouldering, still visible in him, to suggest that if young Bradley Headstone, when a pauper lad, had chanced to be told off for the sea, he would have not been the last man in a ship's crew. Regarding that origin of his, he was proud, moody and sullen, desiring it to be forgotten, and few people knew of it. So this is our introduction to Bradley Headstone, and that repetition of the word decent emphasises his complete respectability, but also this kind of claustrophobic sense of that respectability, that he is all bound up in his decent clothing, and yet beneath him there is something that's a bit more fiery and a bit more interesting, perhaps, than his decent exterior. Bradley Headstone is the embodiment of a respectable man, and the way that Dickens deals with this throughout the book, and what that says about Dickens's ideas of respectability and what effects respectability can have on people is really, really fascinating and worth keeping an eye for throughout the book. And Bradley Headstone is set at complete contrast to Eugene Wrayburn when we witness him at the end of this chapter. Eugene Wrayburn walks past the master and pupil, and Dickens says something in the careless manner of this person, in a certain lazily arrogant air with which he approached, holding possession of twice as much pavement as another would have claimed, instantly caught the boy's attention. And there is this complete contrast drawn there between Bradley and Eugene, between the respectable yet repressed Bradley Headstone and the careless, open Eugene Wrayburn, who is lazily arrogant. There is such a distinction drawn between them that is really, really interesting here. And let us turn now to Jenny Wren, who, as I have said, is one of my absolute favourite characters. I love her, she is great. She is quite an eccentric, unusual character, very Dickensian in many ways. Dickens first describes her as a child, a dwarf, a girl, a something. The first thing she says is, I can't get up because my back's bad and my legs are queer, but I'm the person of the house. And there's something in that sentence which is quite effective, I think. The fact that the first thing she says is she makes them aware of her disability, but then she says, but I'm the person of the house, to emphasise that regardless of this fact, she is still the person in charge here and she is who they should look to. It said that Jenny Wren is about 12 or 13 years old, and yet she demands repeatedly throughout the chapter to be treated as an adult. The fact that she says, I'm the person of the house, and the fact that Dickens refers to her throughout this chapter and the next as the person of the house really emphasises this and her importance as a figure of authority almost within the house. She is a doll's dressmaker, and she refers to that as my trade, and talks quite a lot about the way in which she works throughout the chapter. She clearly takes a lot of pride in the work she does, and it is clearly the way that she supports herself. And she says, don't talk of children, I can't bear children, I know their tricks and their manners. Or, I mean always to keep among none but grown-ups till I marry. I suppose I must make up my mind to marry one of these days. She talks very much as though she's an adult, and she completely declines to be treated as a child and to be grouped with other children, which is quite interesting and makes her quite an interesting character throughout the book. Charlie Hexam is quite cruel about her. He refers to her as a little witch, or a little crooked antic of a child, or old person, or whatever it is, in quite a nasty way. But actually we see that between Jenny Wren and Lizzie there is quite a nice friendship and a sort of tender relationship between them, which is quite nice. And one of the things I love about Jenny Wren and love about Jenny Wren throughout the books is just the way she talks and some of the things she says. I find her incredibly hilarious. I like the way that she personifies all of her dolls, and that she says, and they take no care of their clothes and they never keep to the same fashions for a month. I work for a doll with 3 daughters, bless you, she's enough to ruin her husband. Or when she's talking about other children and how much she hates them. Oh, I know their tricks and their manners, and I'll tell you what I'll do to punish them. There's doors under the church in the square, black doors leading into black vaults. Well, I'd open one of those doors and cram them all in, and I'd lock the door, and through the keyhole I'd blow in pepper. The fact that this girl, who is in many ways repressed by her drunken father and the life she leads, and the fact that she cannot move around very easily, yet she has this kind of violent temper and at the same time a great sweetness, especially towards Lizzie, that I really, really like. I like that contrast in her character between her sweetness towards Lizzie but also her violence and some of the things she says, which are quite entertaining and quite startling for a 12-year-old girl. Now, another key theme in this chapter, as well as that of respectability, is that of education. The chapter is called Of an Educational Character, and the first thing we witness in the chapter is a description of the school that Charlie first went to and how rubbish it was, effectively. Dickens' great criticism of the school system and of the way that many people from working class backgrounds were educated. Dickens talks about the fact that a lot of the poor schools teach that you were to do good, not because it was good, but because you were to make a good thing of it. The idea that morality is taught in schools as a way of getting on in life, not as a good way to live your life because it's a good thing to do. And Dickens is quite critical of the school system in this way, even if he is a little bit less critical of the school that Charlie ends up working at or studying at. And Charlie, now that he is gaining this education that his father so despised, is really worried that Lizzie's lack of education will hold him back. And we have this, again, this idea of education as being a complete divider within society, and of the problematic nature of education. In book 1 there was a lot about the fact that Gaffer Hexam really disapproved of the idea of education because he felt that because it was of a different class to him, it therefore was in a way beneath him, and that kind of pride stopped him wanting his children to have an education and to be able to learn how to read and write. Bradley Headstone clearly has this particular expectation in his head of what Lizzie Hexam will be like because she doesn't know how to read and write, and yet his expectations are unfounded, and he says later to Charlie after he's met Lizzie that your sister scarcely looks or speaks like an ignorant person. And we again find the theme of education brought up here because actually Lizzie isn't an ignorant person at all, and actually she is quite an intelligent person, but she doesn't know how to read or write, and this therefore separates her in a way from Bradley and from Charlie. And this quite nicely takes us on, in fact, to the next chapter. Now in chapter 2 of book 2, still educational, we follow on with Lizzie and Jenny where we left off with them. They are discussing Bradley and Charlie now that they have left, and then Eugene Rayburn pays a call. Eugene Rayburn, again in this chapter, is really set apart from Bradley and Charlie. He behaves in a very, very different matter, yet this chapter is also related to education in a way because Eugene comes there to offer his services to pay for an education for Lizzie and Jenny. And Lizzie has apparently been resisting for some time, but Lizzie eventually in this chapter kind of gives in and decides that she will accept this offer from Eugene. And then after Eugene leaves, we get this scene between Jenny Wren and her drunken father, who comes home in quite a state, and Jenny tells him off. We have this interesting reversal that Dickens operates through a lot of the character of Jenny Wren, in which Jenny Wren acts as an adult to all of the people around her and treats everyone else like a child because no one ever treats her like a child. She acts as the parent to her father and refers to him throughout the book as her child, even though it's her father, because he doesn't behave as a father should do because he is always drunk, and she is the one who has to think about money and has to try and create a life for them because he doesn't do that work. And we do see the pain that Jenny feels in this and the great complication and sorrow it brings to her life living with this father, but we also see the happiness she gets from her relationship with Lizzie, and we also see Dickens' respect and admiration for her, which I think is quite important. Jenny is presented in quite an interesting way throughout the book. I've spoken before in some of my What the Dickens videos about the fact that in Dickens' early books and in a lot of Victorian literature there's a lot of very problematic presentation of people with disabilities. And I think Jenny Wren is one of the few characters in Dickens who has a disability and is presented in a very complex light. Not to say that everything is perfect about her presentation and the way that Dickens deals with her disability, but I think it is done a lot better than a lot of other Victorian literature, and she is so much more than the fact that she struggles to walk. There is so much more to her character, and the way that she is so important, the way that she's defined by her status as the person of the house and the doll's dressmaker, by the things that she does. The fact that she is so industrious and that she works really hard and that she works to support herself is very important, especially in a writer like Dickens, who isn't often that kind to working women, especially in his earlier books. But in Our Mutual Friend, we do have a lot of working women who are presented in a very interesting light and in a very kind of heroic light in many ways. There is in this chapter a kind of criticism of Jenny Wren in some ways, and Dickens says in the very end of this chapter, "The person of the house was the person of a house full of sordid shames and cares, with an upper room in which an abased figure was infecting even innocent sleep with sensual brutality and degradation. The doll's dressmaker had become a little quaint shrew, of the world, worldly, of the earth, earthy. Poor doll's dressmaker. How often so dragged down by the hands that should have raised her up, how often so misdirected when losing her way on the eternal road and asking guidance. Poor, poor little doll's dressmaker." And there is something that's a bit patronising and a bit critical in that paragraph, and yet throughout the book I think there is a much more interesting development of Jenny, and I personally, I don't view Jenny Wren as a shrew at all. I think she is a wonderful character, and that contrast in her of the violence with which she talks about how she would like to hurt various people who have been mean to her and what she would do if her husband turned out to be a drunkard is quite interesting. But there's also that sweetness with which she feels about Lizzie and the way that she speaks to Lizzie that is very kind. She says to Lizzie, "You're more to be relied upon than silver and gold." And you see this mix of her good nature and the way that it has at times been battered by the world she lives in and by the horrible family situation she's in. And yet again, she is hilarious, and I love her dialogue. I love the way that she talks to Eugene, as well as referring to her father as her child. She also says when Eugene suggests that he might buy a doll, "You had better not. You're sure to break it. All you children do." And the fact that Dickens creates this character in this 12 or 13-year-old girl is for me really, really powerful, and she's such a brilliant, interesting character. Also important to note that Jenny Wren is not her real name. Dickens tells us in this chapter that her real name is Fanny Cleaver, but she calls herself Jenny Wren because she is attempting to make her own identity. She refuses to be defined by her father and by the biological family she's been born into, but gives herself this new identity of Jenny Wren, which has in many ways a kind of fairy tale sound to it. I can't remember if it's actually a character from a fairy tale or not, but Jenny Wren certainly sounds like a fairy tale character, which emphasises Jenny's kind of desire to lift herself from this situation into a new one. It emphasises her imagination, her desire to be a different person and kind of create her own identity, which I think is quite interesting and quite important. Now, the other interesting thing in this chapter is of course the dynamic between Eugene and Lizzie. We do get to see a lot of Eugene's character in this chapter, and more than we have previously. Previously I think we've only seen Eugene in the company of Mortimer, and he does have a slightly different character in the company of Mortimer, but now in the company of Lizzie there's something slightly different about him, and we see this kind of changed aspect of him and his growing interest in Lizzie. Though it's quite hard to tell at times what exactly his interest is. Lizzie certainly finds it quite hard to tell what his interest is. There's this implication that she had been putting off accepting his offer of education because she thought that his intentions were slightly dubious, and then she decides actually that she kind of believes that he is a good and moral person and that he couldn't possibly be thinking of her in that way because she's so far beneath him, and therefore that is part of the thing that makes her accept him. Eugene, like Jenny, I think, is a character who becomes very sympathetic through the language he uses and the way that he talks. His dialogue is wonderful, and even though often his dialogue is very telling of the kind of person that he is, and he freely admits to being the not very nice, not very moral person that he is, it's still very, very engaging because of the way he talks. So Jenny says to him, "You may come in if you're good," and Eugene says, "I am not good, but I'll come in," which is just a lovely exchange and something I really, really enjoy. I love it when Dickens does those kind of things with language. And another exchange between Eugene and Jenny. Again, I love their relationship and dynamics so much. "Generally, I confess myself a man to be doubted," returned Eugene coolly. "For all that." "Why are you?" asked the sharp Miss Wren. "Because, my dear," said the airy Eugene, "I am a bad, idle dog." "Then why don't you reform and be a good dog?" inquired Miss Wren. "Because, my dear," returned Eugene, "there's nobody who makes it worth my while." Then we have this conversation between Eugene and Lizzie in which he is persuading her to take up his offer of education, in which he's kind of emotionally blackmailing her to take up the offer. He says things like, "I propose to be of use to somebody, which I never was in this world, and never shall be on any other occasion. There's this idea that what makes Lizzie turn and say, actually no, I will accept your help, is because she thinks that maybe he is in earnest, and that makes us as readers think that maybe he is in earnest. This man who is not usually very much in earnest at all and is careless and gloomy in everything he does, we see this kind of growing interest of his in Lizzie, and regardless of the form that that interest takes, it might be of some service to her. This is of course quite an interesting chapter to follow on from the last, in which Charlie and Bradley at the end of the chapter were making some possible plan for the idea of Lizzie's education, and yet here we find that Eugene is already making this plan, and that Charlie and Bradley are probably not going to be very happy about that fact. Both of these two chapters I love very much. I love the introduction to Bradley Headstone and Jenny Wren, who are two brilliant, brilliant characters, and I love the changing relationships between Lizzie and her brother, and also between Lizzie and Eugene. It's very interesting to note in this chapter how Lizzie is so distinctly uncomfortable in Eugene's presence, whereas Eugene is as comfortable in his presence as he is in everybody else's, and yet there is this idea, Dickens mentions Eugene being a little more focused perhaps at this moment than he usually is, this idea of this growing connection between them, which is really, really interesting. And then chapter 3 of book 2 is A Piece of Work, and here is another society chapter in which we are returning to the light present tense odd style of the society chapters, which I so love. I really love the writing style Dickens uses in these chapters. I find it hilarious and just really thoroughly enjoyable. Listen to the first paragraph of this chapter, it's just wonderful. Britannia, sitting meditating one fine day, perhaps in the attitude in which she is presented in the copper coinage, discovers all of a sudden that she wants Veneering in Parliament. It occurs to her that Veneering is a representative man, which cannot in these times be doubted, and that Her Majesty's faithful Commons are incomplete without him. So in this chapter, Veneering is put forward to Parliament and gets all his friends to go around and work for him and tell everybody else about him in the hope that they will manage to vote him in and get him into Parliament, and of course he does get into Parliament and becomes an MP. As with Dickens' other society chapters, it is in my mind very, very hilarious, but also full of social criticism. The way he writes this chapter is basically about how false and silly politics is, and comparing the work that these people are doing, which is not really work but really going around and talking to people, to the actual work of people like Bradley Headstone or Jenny Wren or Lizzie Hexam or Charlie Hexam, the people who actually do work, in comparison with the Veneerings and Lady Tippings and Mr Twemlow and people like that. Throughout this chapter we find incidences of the falseness, the complete facade of upper class society and also of politics. The fact that Veneering is running opposed and that everyone thinks that it's so important for them to all go out and work and spread the word, but actually really it doesn't really matter, and because he's going to get in anyway because he's not opposed. The fact that he gives this speech on getting into Parliament, which is just completely nonsensical, in which he doesn't really say anything. The fact that everyone he goes to see, he says that his political opinions are identical to theirs, even though in fact he has no political opinions at all. And then of course the very telling thing that Twemlow says to himself at the end about Veneering: "Gracious heavens, now I have time to think of it. He never saw one of his constituents in all his days until we saw them together." Which is pretty telling that Veneering is not really fit to be an MP and is not really going to do anything good for any of the people in his constituency, because he doesn't really know anything about them and he just wants the position and the power. He just wants to further his position as respectable and important within London society. Everything within this chapter is there to emphasise the complete fakeness of British politics. I love that when Veneering asks Twemlow what he thinks about the House of Commons, Twemlow replies, "I think that it is the best club in London." The idea that politics for these people is just social. It's just all about society and who you know, and the only purpose it serves is to get you into better society and to get you into like a higher class within society. It's awful. It's full of such humour, but also such sharp wit and social criticism. The parody and the pastiche that Dickens creates here, the way that he criticises politics in this chapter is just wonderful and something I really enjoy. I find it hilarious, but also painful because it's true. And what Dickens is basically pointing out is that the people who are in Parliament in the House of Commons are not really representative of anyone. Veneering described as being representative, whereas in fact he really doesn't represent anyone. The fact that what they're doing is described as work, what we know by contrasting Veneering to the actually working class characters in the book, that what Veneering is doing here is not really work, and the fact that everything is just so silly and that these characters are just so preposterous. My favourite thing in this chapter, I think, is when Mrs Veneering is talking to Lady Tippings about how clever her baby is, and the butler of the Veneering's house, always described as the analytical chemist, is looking on and observing them in a glorious, glorious way. "You will all think it foolish of me, I know, but I must mention it. As I sat by Baby's crib on the night before the election, Baby was very uneasy in her sleep." The analytical chemist, who is gloomily looking on, has diabolical impulses to suggest, wind and throw up his situation, but represses them. I do have to say that I find Mrs. Veneering and the way she speaks about her baby one of the most like repulsive, horrible things in all of Dickens. It's just so silly and awful and cringeworthy. Could it be, I asked myself, that the fairies were telling Baby that her papa would shortly be an MP? The way that Dickens draws these awful people is so brilliantly and hilariously done. I just enjoy it so much. Yes. Anyway, there we have it. Those are the 3 chapters we read for October for our mutual friend. Please let me know down in the comments what you thought of these chapters and how you enjoyed them, and especially how you enjoyed Bradley Headstone and Jenny Wren, who I think are brilliant, masterly characters. Book 2 of our mutual friend is for me where it really gets good, because it's where we get introduced to some of my favourite characters. I'm looking forward to the rest of the book and to November's chapters. So in the month of November, we'll be reading Chapter 4, Cupid Prompted, Chapter 5, Mercury Prompting, and Chapter 6, A Riddle Without an Answer. You can expect to see a little more of the Lamleys this month, which shall of course be very exciting. So I hope you're all enjoying our mutual friend as we go. Please let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and I'll be back very soon with another video. Hopefully in November I will be less behind on my chapters of our mutual friend, and the video might actually be up around the end of the month. We shall see. Anyway, I'll see you soon.